it takes discipline to learn to say, I don't know, humility. And what has had happened during the pandemic, and now that I look down, now my eyes are open, I see it around all the time, is that on the BBC and CNN, giving a confident answer to a question where they really should be saying, I don't know.
And it was worse than that, wasn't it? It was mantras of things like safe and effective, and let people be able to make informed consent and judgment. Say, well, look, we've done this thing real fast. We're not entirely sure. It's your call. These are the consequences of not doing it. These are the consequences. No, cost benefit. That's the way, surely, to treat the public and citizens, right? In a grown up, responsible. Talk about being responsible.
The establishment, the scientific establishment, the public health establishment, decided that they wanted to talk to people like children, that they couldn't understand complexity, they couldn't understand uncertainty, and we've reaped the rewards of lack of confidence in science and medicine as a result of it.
I'm here in DC, and this was the interview we did on the eve of the inauguration with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Really hope you enjoy it. Jay, good to see you.
Yeah.
It's been a while. You were speaking recently at an event that we did, and you've spoken before live with us. And this last few years has been a lot for everyone around the world. The co-creator of the Great Barrington Declaration, and lots more that everyone knows about now. I suppose it's like just to reflect for a second, because in Britain we're having these conversations about new things, but also some of the lessons of the past and all of that. I mean, I wanted to see what your thoughts are on some of this, like what's happened with the discussion around health and science and all that from your point of view, and where we are now. I mean, any one of those is a huge discussion, but how do you see things now, where we're at in the States and internationally?
Alan, if you think back on the COVID period, and the main root dysfunction was that the way that science ought to operate didn't operate correctly. A lot of the bad ideas, which then led to very bad policies, the school closures, the lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, all of these policies were premised on false ideas about how the material world works, right? If we just lock down, the virus will go away and keep everybody safe. If we close schools, children won't spread the virus and the virus will go away. If we have everyone take the vaccine, then the virus will stop spreading, the virus will go away. Each of these things turned out to be false. Why did the scientific community not correct them? Right? And so the root problem, and by the way, it's not just about COVID. Like, there are a whole host of beliefs about the way the world works, the material world works, that are supposedly rooted in science that I don't know if it's true or false. And the question is, how is it that the scientific process, which is supposed to produce reliable answers to questions about material reality, why does it not work? That, to me, is the root problem.
I mean, it's a fascinating question. People will say, you've got all these brilliantly trained people, and they are colleagues. It's a question I keep asking myself. 7, 9 years sometimes, brilliant minds, medicine, science. And yet this thing happened, and it was almost as though there were obviously vocal critics like yourself, but on top of spy units and censoring, a lot in the medical establishment didn't challenge or actually were advocates for be quiet, do this, you're all being dangerous, it's follow the science. What happened with that?
I mean, that's exactly, so that, the idea that you should censor people that disagree with the consensus is a symptom of the failure of the scientific process.
Totally.
I believe very strongly in science. I think science is a force for great good and has been for centuries.
Yeah.
But it takes certain structures to work properly. And the key structure that is needed for science to work essentially is humility. I have a scientific idea. It may or may not be right. It has some implications. I can test it myself and see. I could give you some reason to believe it. But until other independent people test my idea, try out the same idea, try to replicate or reproduce it, my idea is not actually that reliable. It's science, but it's not reliable science. What's happened is that science has moved away from this kind of commitment to humility, to do reproduction, replication, to testing. It looks like it does, right? So, for instance, in order to get a scientific idea into the scientific community, I have to go put it send to a journal. The journal will then do peer review, right? What is peer? I've peer reviewed thousands and thousands of papers in my life. Um, Peer review, what it is not what most people think it is. It's not, I get your data and I check it myself and then try to redo your thing and test it.
Right.
It's, I read your paper and I look for holes in the published, the paper that you wrote, ask you to check things, but I'm not checking myself. I'm just asking you to do extra checks.
Yeah.
That's good. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient for reliability. What's really sufficient for reliability is, hundreds of other people look at your question, try it from a different angle, maybe see if it works in different populations, and they get the same answer as you. That's what real reliability and truth is in science. And that's what we got away from during the pandemic. Instead, you had a narrow group of people, relatively small group of people, enmeshed in groupthink, who walled themselves off from any criticism of censorship, making sure that there was no even attempt at replication that could sort of pierce the public mind.
I mean, if you think about all the lessons we've learned in history, from the Copernican revolution, Galileo, it's often seen as though it was the past, it was other institutions that were sort of rabidly preventing knowledge and enlightened thinking. And we know those stories well, but some of the advocates of those stories were the very people that were doing what you're describing, stopping people from saying that it's harmful, it's going to be dangerous. And that kind of examination, exploration, what is a theory? How do you put it under test? Do you think that that's been so damaged? It's irretrievable? Do you think, how do you think, and also from the public imagination, and what that means moving forwards? What do you think about that?
I think that actually I'm quite hopeful. Great. I think that that the structures of science, most scientists want to learn true things about the material. That's why they went into science. It's quite exciting, right? If science is working properly, you're going to learn new things. You're going to be surprised, and that surprise is what makes being a scientist fun.
Yeah.
I mean, no one wants to live in a I already know all the truths about the world and I need to just repeat the dogma. Very few people want to do that. Live in the world like that, where all I do is repeat the dogma. If I repeat the dogma, I can go up a social structure. That's not science. What we want, so how do you fix that? The key thing is you change how science is, it's like the measurement of what excellent science is. Right? It should not be, am I published in a peer-reviewed journal? Like for instance, there's there's a site that people probably know about. Lots of scientists look at this. It's a site called Google Scholar, and if you look for every scientist that's listed there, they'll have a number. It looks like a cricket card, baseball card for how productive the scientist is, and the measure they put there is like the number of citations you have. So I publish a paper, you cite my paper in the paper you write. That's a measure of my success, right? Mm. But really what it is it's not a measure of truth. It's a measure of influence of an idea. Sometimes that's because the idea is true, and other times it's for other reasons. Influence is not the same thing as truth. We're measuring and rewarding influence. But if we measure and reward, are you replicated? Are your scientific ideas, have independent teams looked at it and you cooperated with the replication effort? Then what will happen is that scientists will want to be replicated, because the measure of success is, are they replicated? And then the incentives for scientists will point toward, do I have ideas that are true? I mean, there have been all these scandals. The public doesn't generally know about them, but of scientists publishing work with fraudulent pictures of scientific experiments. Papers retracted, major figures in the scientific community, and with real implications for the health of people, right? So advances in Alzheimer's, for instance, that should have happened didn't happen because there's all these sort of falsification of experiments. We don't really have a reliable basis for understanding exactly what causes Alzheimer's.
Why did that happen?
It's incentives. Actually, this is one of these things where like my being an economist actually helps. So I can see this very clearly, right? The incentives are to publish papers that are very, very, very influential, right? I'm measuring that. People will react to that. And so the reason they do that is because those papers aren't checked for truth. they're checked for influentialness.
Right. Well, so it's like an algorithm that self reinforces itself. I mean, we did a study slightly different, but with Ben Pyle on the reason why things are published. And in fact, there happen to be some very influential billionaires who have a particular view, a sort of green view, that have now dominated the academy and also the public sphere, because in terms of getting things published that question those things and challenge becomes really difficult to get published and to get done. So by default, unlike, say, somewhere else in another country where there's censorship, effectively, both there and also with MPs and others, they don't get to hear things that might challenge those things, like around the discussion around clean air, for instance. And
Well, food, yeah, and there's a lot of like ideas that are off limits because there's essentially gatekeeping, or the publication is a gatekeep. Now, sometimes it's not bad necessarily. You have like the gatekeeping, which shouldn't be though on the ideas, right? The gatekeeping should be on the reliability, like the checking, right? So if you have rather than having publication in a top journal as a measure of success, you have the publication of an idea that is replicated as a measure of success, whether it's in a top journal or anywhere else. Right. So what then is needed is a change in the kinds of rewards that scientists have when they do good science. If they're doing good science that's replicated, that should increase your social status as a scientist. Not, am I publishing my paper in essentially a gate-kept peer-reviewed journal?
it seems that they don't mind the media and others when you're talking about space-time curvature, if you're talking about quantum mechanics and physics versus the theory of relativity, because it can be seen as very abstract and it's not really in it. But when it comes to, you must wear a mask or you must do this to protect granny, but then you haven't really established the efficacy of something. And even if there is efficacy, should everyone therefore be dispensed with their right to make decisions and autonomy? Hundreds of years and thousands of years really of our view about choice and discretion and judgment. We had the whole campaign with frontline NHS staff and doctors who've been doing it for a year, and then they were mandated. We know here that police, fire officers, doctors, others had it done to them. Many fought back. They were stigmatized, they were spied on, they were smeared. We lost 45,000 care workers, right? We still have not come back from that. How, just learning the lessons from that and doing it differently, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think so. Just suppose we had a reliable scientific literature.
Yeah.
Right. So the basis of those firings was that people that were not vaccinated were somehow dangerous to others.
Yeah.
It was a false idea. Like the vaccine doesn't actually protect you from getting and spreading COVID. So vaccinated and unvaccinated alike had the possibility of spreading COVID.
Yeah.
Right. So if the true scientific idea that what I just said was true had been established, then there would not have been a mandate.
Let's pause there for a second. That is such a simple but profound at the same time point that for a long time we were taken down from all sorts of platforms, and before what was Twitter and is now X, all of the Twitter files, the lockdown files, all the things that you've spoken about and we've seen, that just that statement was presented as being an enemy from within and somehow a dangerous thing. And yet that's the truth of it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think about this, Alan. So you have a wrong scientific idea then leading to all kinds of tremendous social harm. People losing their jobs, being stigmatized, families being riven apart by a false scientific idea. So to me, if you address the root problem, you need to make science more reliable so that the false scientific ideas do not become enmeshed in our culture. There's another part of that, and you alluded to this. I think it's quite important that knowing how the material world works by itself is not actually sufficient for deciding what policy should be. I believe, suppose it were true that the vaccine stopped you from getting and spreading COVID. I suppose that were true. Still, that does not justify treating people who do not get the vaccine as a pariah. Right? There are moral restrictions, in my mind, on how human beings should treat one another. Ethical restrictions on how human beings should treat one another. And those moral and ethical restrictions are not the subject of scientific inquiry. Those are just our basic humanity pushes in our direction to treat other human beings as our neighbors, people to love, to respect. And so even if you have a vaccine that stops you from spreading COVID, that doesn't mean you should have warrant to ostracize the other.
Mm. And it's a betrayal of science, isn't it? Which what we really, Jay, if people say there is only one way to look at this, there is no question, there is no shining the light, there is no attempt to work out different theoretical relationships to it. And if you do that, you're a pariah, and or worse, you may get a knock at the door. We've seen that with other things happen, right, where people are saying different things to what's allowed. How much do you think we've all learned? I say not. I mean, you have known this. You've been arguing this for a while, but I'd say now the public, right? Because we've just got an ongoing so-called COVID inquiry in Britain, and we don't think it's fit for purpose because it doesn't even ask whether we should have had the lockdowns. I mean, if you have an inquiry about something and don't ask that question, that seems to be not fit for purpose. But in terms of
I agree with you about that. And you're spending hundreds of millions of pounds, if I understand, on this inquiry that's not asking some of the most basic questions that one want answers to.
Yeah. And then, we see that some institutions globally want to carry on doing things the same again and say that we're all, the ones who don't agree, are somehow being a threat and a danger. Same old narrative, right? They often use certain terms like the C word, you're a conspiracist or far right. It's amazing how many different people they call far right now for all sorts of things like having our enlightenment values of free speech. But how much do you think, like with the public and also with the medical and scientific establishment and journalists, we're learning these lessons for to not repeat it again all over again?
I mean, I've been tracking in the United States surveys of public confidence in scientists and in doctors, and it's at the lowest levels I've ever seen it. I think something like only 40% of patients trust their doctor.
Wow.
Have strong trust in their doctor. It used to be 70, 80%, still very, one of the most trusted professions. Yeah. And even trust in scientists has collapsed. And the fruits of that are actually in many ways terrible, because there are really good, important facts about science that undergird actions we take. And it's important that we know those facts, right? So I lament this, but at the same time, I think the scientific community, the medical community, and the public health community did it to themselves, right? The public is responding to something real. And so you're asking, does public understand? I don't think the public understands the details of it, but I think they understood, at least intuitively, that there is something deeply wrong with the scientific endeavor, at least the institutions of science, because it's not producing the answers that allow us to live our lives in the right way.
So, I mean, that thing about trust, there's been a big discussion about trust over the last 2 decades, really, about trust. Obviously, we've seen with politicians, with journalists, they're often, bankers. We've seen that in previous periods where the public feel like they're estranged. They don't have a relationship. They don't feel like they can shape things. They're not listened to. In Britain, we had a big mandate for something around Brexit, and then politicians just went and did what they wanted anyway, right? So there's a sense in which people are understandably somewhat cynical I mean, I wonder how much of that it is and how much it was specifically like what happened with the lockdowns and the fear nudge and the PR. But we also know a lot of more people are now not taking all sorts of, for their children, and not giving them all sorts of other vaccinations.
Right.
And as you say, to just jettison any sense of all the achievements of science and medicine is a big problem as well. And this is the other terrible thing that you and others warned about before. If you just behave in a cavalier way, say the science,
right,
that this happens. How would you see that could be turned around?
I think the key thing is humility.
Right.
Public health leaders, scientists, and the medical professionals need to be humble in front of the public. And I think just to go back to the COVID era, because it's such a prominent example in my mind, you had medical doctors and scientists confidently saying things that they could not possibly have known. Wasn't in the scientific literature yet.
Yeah.
And so you see them on the BBC or in CNN or whatever, confidently asserting things that were just not knowable. And I was a med student once. I do research full time now, but I was a med student once. I once wanted in medical school. When you're a trainee doctor, you don't really know all that much, but you put on a white jacket and you sit in front of a patient. The patient asks you a question. The desire to give an answer to the question even when you don't know the answer, is almost overwhelming because they're expecting you to know the answer. You're wearing the white jacket automatically makes them think that you know the answer.
Safe and effective. So we had this discussion in Britain. It's safe and effective for something that was a procedure that perhaps, you should, well, as you say, didn't stop the transmission, didn't stop you getting it. But then even beyond that, it now looks like there are more consequences to that particular one or series of jabs than many of the other things in the post-war period, right? And then we've had, a yellow card system and VAERS and all that in Britain, and a big discussion about compensation for many people. And yet people repeated this mantra, safe and effective, before they really knew, right? They would do the research, have they done tested it? And they said, we have to do it super turbocharged. Okay, so you're saying it's super turbocharged, really fast. So admit that it's all unprecedented, right? A bit like everything else. And let people be able to make informed consent and judgment. Say, well, look, we've done this thing real fast. We're not entirely sure. It's your call. These are the consequences of not doing it. These are the consequences. No, cost benefit. That's the way, surely, to treat the public and citizens, right? In a grown up, responsible. Talk about being responsible and a way that
I entirely agree with that. Right? That's that. My job is to treat the public like adults because they are adults. They know way more than me actually about almost everything. I've studied some things, and I hope that I can talk to them and show them some things that I've learned. Where I've learned them because other people have checked me and seen I've got the right answer, and so when I talk to the public, I can give them what I know, the uncertainties about it. Instead, the establishment, the scientific establishment, the public health establishment, decided that they wanted to talk to people like children, that they couldn't understand complexity, they couldn't understand uncertainty, and we've reaped the rewards of lack of confidence in science and medicine as a result of it.
And I want to avoid terms sometimes because people can get into decision terms, but we have this discussion about the technocrats who just want to do that and make these impositions or say these strap lines, the spin, fear PR, nudge, rather than having an honest debate and engagement. As you say, it's so refreshing to hear you say this because you think, well, that makes sense. And in a way, I think what everyone's seen in America is things turned on its head somewhat because people who have just been straight and clear and honest with the public, and the public respond to that. And I think we're seeing that more in Britain as well now. People have reacted against what's happened. And those that are just direct talking and saying you can make your own minds up, you don't need nannies to sort of shape and inform and intervene with how you receive this message. But, we think you're grown up big enough to work this all out. How do you see this playing out now in the States and then elsewhere?
Well, I think just very broadly speaking, I think that the public is starting to demand that the scientific and medical institutions reform. Right. So the election of Donald Trump, I think, is in part based on and not fully. I mean, there's a very complicated set of things about this, but I think it contributed to that. Yeah. The discontent in the UK with the ruling Labour Party, I think, is also partly reflects that unease. In fact, also even the rejection of the Tories who embraced the lockdowns when they were in power, I think also partly reflects that. There's a broad public discontent with the establishment that actually failed on exactly this humility basis we've been talking about. Yeah. I'm not a politician and I'm not a political scientist, so it's hard for me to say precisely, but my view from what I've read and seen is that this is a real big part of the general. It lies under the surface. People don't necessarily know how to articulate it exactly, but it's a very important part of the political movements that we're seeing. We're like broad classes of people have understand that the institutions that they have relied on for their health and well-being have not actually representing them appropriately. In fact, in many ways during the COVID pandemic, undertook policies that caused them harm. The vaccine mandates, the lockdowns, the school closures.
So what's so interesting as well about, what's happening in the States is that a group of people that were presented as absolute pariahs, but interestingly, many of which had come from being Democrats until fairly recently, some of them, but a mixed bag of a new group of people that include everyone from Tulsi Gabbard and others, right? That Robert Kennedy and others that were very vociferously presented by some in the MSA and the legacy media as of a particular ilk. And yet there's this sense of enthusiasm in America with the public and others that this is the people's moment, right? A huge majority in every respect. I mean, even those who are honest, who are advocates of Democrats and others. I've spoken to people in New York and in LA and others across different states and cities that still support Democrats. Unless they're completely not being honest, there's a recognition of just how widespread that is. There's a sense of enthusiasm and excitement in America about what's possible and what can be different. Just wonder how you see that as well, just in terms of the old divides of Democrat, Republican, but the new thing that's happening. What do you think about that?
I don't think the old party divisions reflected reality. Okay, I think that the policies that will help the working class, the poor, and others were typically represented by parties on the left. And what we're seeing in the United States is that many parts of that traditional coalition that once upon a time will belong to the Democratic Party have said, we're not being represented by you. And so Donald Trump won election in the United States is drawing a lot of that support that traditionally would go to the left. The UK is interesting because it's still playing itself out. I think that same process is playing itself. You saw it with Brexit, right? So the rise of the Reform Party, the traditional party structures, the Labour and the Tories. There were large classes of people that did not find themselves represented in either party, and so you have the rise of Reform. I think reflects that. The discontent with the Tories that led to the people being deposed reflects that. And Labour, which I think is just in power by default in the UK. It's unless they reform in ways that draw back their old traditional coalition, are going to face tremendous problems. And it's a, I'm an amateur political scientist, so please take it for what it's worth. But that's
what is interesting, because there's just the Spectator's just done a piece on Lord Maurice Glasman, who has written extensively from blue Labour point of view, meaning what they sometimes call the Red Wall, but working class Labour has been abandoned by its very name represented Labour, and it's abandoned those people in a way, pointing to America to say, look at those areas, whether it's Pennsylvania or the Appalachians or the South. This idea of working people is central. It should be the public, the demos. And it's instructive that they have seemed to have jettisoned all of that. And in a way, the Conservatives and Labour, Conservatives don't really want to conserve too much, many of them anymore. And they're saying so more now in opposition. So I think you're right about what's new. It's exciting. I wonder, you obviously are very well informed about what's happening in Britain as well. But some of the things that are now playing out, what would you say about, for looking forwards to the future, the ways to avoid, you've said humility, and that point's noted, but also there's thinking about how the relationship between the press, politicians, the public, and the scientific medical establishment, right? And where we go from here when we're told about things like bird flu or other things.
The press is actually quite interesting, because they've relied on, it's a kind of laziness in some sense. Like they've relied on a certain small group of experts telling them what's true about science.
Right.
If scientists start acting in a humble way where they're reflecting the uncertainty, how will the press report on that uncertainty? They won't have pat answers. They won't be able to say this is the science, because in many, many scientific areas, there's going to be controversy that they really need to report properly. In other scientific areas, maybe less controversy, right? So they're going to need to become much more sophisticated about conveying scientific uncertainty to the public, rather than being essentially handmaidens of a small group of very powerful scientist bureaucrats that and just convey that message of that group.
There was an article recently, and maybe you can clear this up, but people will say about President Trump, they'll say about you, Rob Kennedy, they'll say all sorts of things, and they're anti this and anti that, but they'll talk about ivermectin, for instance, even though there's a Nobel Prize. You've been You've spoken various points on the issues like this, where sometimes people are misquoted as well. This question about there's a discussion to be had or what the role of something is. What actually happened with it? How would you answer critics to that thing and some of the others?
So, I mean, it's hard to, I've never anticipated in my entire life being the subject of so much public scrutiny. I was as a quiet scientist before 2020. So it's quite frustrating to see my words taken out of context, or were actually falsely attributed to me. I don't know how to fight that other than just to continue to say what I really believe, and hope that people can see where my heart is. I think it must be. I mean, Alan, you've been in public life much more longer, much more effectively than I have. I don't know. I think it must just be part of being part of this public discussion.
Well, what's happened more is that I think, unfortunately, the seriousness of politicians, the seriousness of journalists, the lack of a investigative, critical position, a much more partisan cheerleading, take a press release, regurgitate it. I mean, if you think, like you're saying, the amount that was presented in the press and others that were often at those press releases, press meetings daily in Britain, that were tub thumping and cheerleading and calling for more. Where was the scrutiny, that kind of holding truth to power that people so often talk about? Where was that, rigorous debate and discussion? And when you look back on it now, like I've posted some posts recently about some of my interviews on Sky, and how, but just generally how there was this disdain and contempt for anyone who raised questions, just raising questions. I suppose that we need to cultivate a climate where people are more serious, as well as being maybe humble and humility. But I think you have to be arrogant enough within the humility to say, well, I believe in this, or at least have enough strength to say, everything could be discussed and debated and thrashed out, but I happen to think this is right and true, and in the pursuit of the truth, and be robust on that. And then also, let's hear it all and have it all out.
Exactly. No, that's consistent with humility, right? Humility also involves clear communication about what I believe and my understanding of how the strength of the evidence beyond my belief, right? That's humility is being open to other viewpoints. It doesn't preclude being confident, but I do think that let's focus on the press. The press needs to become much more sophisticated about science. It needs to become much more knowledgeable. They should treat scientists in a way that's similar to the way they treat politicians, right? Politicians that are sincere, that are very clearly expressing things that reflect some ground reality. The press, they often get treated skeptically as well, but sometimes their message shines through if the press is doing its job. And politicians that are, saying falsehoods and eventually the press will expose that, right? Of all parties, I think. This is a general rule, but I believe that's generally true. Scientists, on the other hand, are treated as if they were right no matter what they say, especially scientists that are top scientists and bureaucracies that are experts that whose message aligns with what the policies the press wants. The scientists should be treated by the press in a similar way they treat politicians. They should be subject to respectful scrutiny.
We have an issue in Britain that sometimes the NHS is talked about as the Holy Grail, as a deity in and of itself. And rather than something that's an institution that's human created, that has all sorts of issues, in my opinion, in our opinion, there's far too ideological and far too top heavy and not enough frontline people and all of those things. And to reflect and think about how they're done in Europe, things done very interestingly with much more mixed use and execution in a really good way. If you look at Germany and France, the models, I suppose, though, I want to get to see how you think now, what's next in America, what you'd like to see happen or not, where you see things going, Yeah, you're in the news a lot, Jay.
Yes, and I just we're talking at a time where President Trump is I think intending to nominate me for the position as the head of a major scientific institute. I don't know how that will work out. I'm quite hopeful, actually.
I seem incredible,
and so I don't know. I shouldn't talk too much about this because there's a lot of uncertainty about it. But I don't know. I'm quite optimistic, Alan. Yeah, I think that with the new administration, there's going to be possibilities of really reforming many of the things we talked about, and we'll see. Yeah.
I mean, that's just so exciting. I mean, on that note, I just want to say, I really hope that happens. I think many people in Britain, we, if you've got any messages or thoughts for people in Britain, we are having this conversation also about, you've got Make America Healthy again going on here, not just about a pharmaceutical question and medicine, but also about food, processed food, local. We have a big discussion going on with farmers, food security, local, international, like a bit like food energy. What would your message be to some of us in Britain about both politically and food and health and so and all that kind of?
I'll just stick to science because
Go on, you do that. That's it.
Britain has a tremendous, distinguished history of scientific advance. Isaac Newton comes from Britain. Many of the most important advances in biology, the structure of DNA comes from Britain. Britain has a long history of a scientific establishment that is focused on truth, focused on advancing knowledge for human good.
Yeah.
And I think that if the political structures of the scientific community in Britain reform toward humility, and I believe that it could happen, especially if the United States starts to move in that direction. You can recover that tremendous history and make more history, make scientific advances that really address the problems you're talking about food, about agriculture, about human health in ways that we can barely begin to imagine now. It's possible. We have to make the changes in our social structures, our scientific structures, reward the right things. And I think the politics are lagging, a lagging indicator where the people are. And what gives me great hope is to see the people of Britain wanting that. And I think eventually the politics will catch up with it.
Well, Jay, I just want to say, and I think I've said this to you before, but I would say it for the record publicly, we're really grateful to you for your co-founding, along with Sunetra Gupta and a couple of key people that were really influential, the great Barrington Declaration, but also for your smarts, your honesty, your good nature, and your humility. You've been a great ambassador in spite of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or comments. But fortuna comes in different ways. And I really hope that you will continue to be someone who makes a big mark. And I really hope in, whatever happens with the administration and all of that, that's the case. And I want to say thank you from everyone, certainly our viewers and everyone in Britain, and good luck with everything.
Thank you so much, Alan. Pleasure to be.
If you like what you saw on the video here, make sure you click on here, because we need to carry on the work we're doing. And the way we do that is through our membership. We'd love you to join. Click on here, see what you can do, and be part of making things better for all of us together. Thank you.